Welcome back to a local church podcast. Today, I want to study or focus on Matthew chapter 2, particularly the Magi from the east. Now, we know them as the wise men. Typically, there's three in the nativity scene. There's probably more than three, but we typically use three because of the gifts that they bring at the end. But when they see this star, they're filled with this joy. And I want to kind of start with this. They saw what they were looking for because of something they believed was going to take place.
You're listening to a local church podcast hosted by my dad, Pastor Ryan Markham. Be sure to leave a review and share this resource. Love God, love people, make disciples.
Hey, welcome back. We are going to continue our journey through Advent. Now, we've talked a little bit about Advent in the last couple of podcasts. I'm flying solo for this podcast because we want to put something out there. But get ready. This Christmas Eve, we're going to be putting out a top 10 movie list for Christmas. You don't want to miss that. It's going to be awesome. Advent, or Adventus in Latin, points us to the anticipation of the arrival of something, right? And so when we think about Advent for Christmas, it's the arrival of God in the flesh, Jesus, born in a manger, but also it's a anticipation looking for Jesus's return as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's interesting that we're talking about the Magi because we find them in the book of Matthew, or Matthew's account. Matthew writes in such a way that points the reader, Jewish audience, to the overarching truth that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. And so it's perfect for Advent and Matthew's context. Jesus is it. Jesus is the one that all of the prophecies in the Old Testament point to. He's the one that fulfills the promise. He's the one that is the Messiah. He's the one that's coming to save that which is lost. So if you got a Bible, turn to Matthew chapter 2. I'll be reading from the ESV. We're going to read verses 1 through 12, and we're going to jump into some things. Matthew chapter 2, 1 through 12. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the peoples, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea. For so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly, and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go, and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. And after listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen, when it rose, went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down, worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, and frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, this is the account of the Magi coming from the east and seeing baby Jesus, worshiping him in his house. Charles Spurgeon says this of this passage: Those who look for Jesus will see him. Those who truly see him will worship him. Those who worship him will consecrate their substance to him, their entire being. That's the theme of this passage. If you're looking for Jesus, you're going to find him. If you truly seek Jesus, you're going to worship him. And if you worship him in spirit and in truth, you're going to give him your life. and you're going to set apart all the things that you say, do, live your life, however you live your life, it is to Jesus. Now, verse 1 gives us some understanding. There's two different people mentioned in verse 1. You have Herod, and you have wise men from the east. There's a third. It says now after Jesus was born. So there's actually three, right? So you have Jesus, Herod, and the Magi, or the wise men from the east. Now, if you don't know anything about Herod, Herod's an interesting individual. He's kind of a bad dude. He ruled Israel and Judah from 37 to 4 BC. He was appointed king of the Jews, like earthly king of the Jews, under the authority of Rome. So Caesar Augustus, the emperor of Rome, appointed Herod as king of the Jews. That's interesting as we read this passage. He was a builder. He's big on infrastructure. He restored the temple in Jerusalem. He built many different palaces, fortresses, and different structures. But it says in the last day, or the last years of his life, suffered an illness that compounded his paranoia. So he was already a paranoid individual, but as he was getting later in years, whatever illness he had, it made his paranoia even that much greater. He turned to cruelty and fits of rage and jealousy. He killed close associates. Among those was his own wife, several sons, and other relatives. Now, this is Herod, the one Jesus was born, I guess, pseudo under, right, as he was appointed by Rome as king of the Jews. But the real king of the Jews, Jesus, was being born under King Herod. Now, the wise men, they are from the east, and they move west to go see Jesus. They worship him, and they give him gifts. That's the mention. That's what we know of these guys from this passage. But if you were to go to the Old Testament, there's several passages, and even in the book of Acts, there's mention of the same type of word, magician, magi. But here's kind of some of the things, I guess a list from the Old Testament. The name Magi was given to these types of individuals by the Babylonians, the Chaldeans. Medes, Persians, and others referred to them as Magi. Now, Magi is a word that points to magician, but it also applied to a wide range of people, particularly the ones who practiced or studied astrology. They were teachers, they were priests, they studied the sacred text, the Old Testament. They were physicians, they were seers. The big part of that, they were interpreters of dreams, magicians, and sorcerers. The book of Acts uses it as false prophet or sorcerer. Now, these magi from the east were coming for a particular reason to do a particular thing. Now, we mentioned at the beginning that what you're looking for, you're going to find, right? They were looking and waiting for the Messiah. How do we know this? We're going to kind of unpack that in the rest of the scriptures. They were coming to see Jesus for a completely different reason than Herod and then any others that were kind of there. Not only were they true magi, but they surely had been strongly influenced by Jewish tradition or by the Jews that stayed kind of in Babylon area after the exile. Quite possibly even by some of the prophetic writings that they were reading, especially of the book of Daniel. They appear to be among the many God-fearing Gentiles who lived at the time of Christ. Now, you have Herod, you have the wise men, verse 2. They show up to Jerusalem. Now, they wouldn't have went straight to Herod, right? They were probably in Jerusalem, and they were asking the question of different folks, hey, we've seen this star, where's the king born of the Jews? They make their way to Herod, and they ask the same question. Verse 2, where is he who has been born the king of the Jews? Who were they asking? They were asking the earthly king of the Jews. And the Magi come in and say, hey, where is the king who is born? And he's probably like, you're looking at him, right? I'm the king of the Jews. Like, it's me. I'm up there in age, right? If you have to tell people that you're the guy, you're probably not the guy, right? And they say, we saw this star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. Imagine the paranoid King Herod hearing this question, but also their response of they're going to go worship him, right? Charles Spurgeon said, a stir begins as soon as Christ is born. He has not spoken a word. He has not wrought a miracle. He has not proclaimed a single doctrine. But when Jesus was born at the very first, while as yet you hear nothing but infant cries and can see nothing but infant weakness, still his influence upon the world is manifest. When Jesus was born, there came wise men from the east, and several others after them. There is infinite power even in the infant Savior. The wise men, they were likely familiar with the Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiah. Numbers 24:17 says, "A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." They were familiar with the sacred text. They knew kind of this moment, this aha moment. They were astrologers. They looked at the sky and they see this star, this supernatural star, and they say this to King Herod. Hey, where is he who has been born king of the Jews? But he says, "For we saw his star." This is Matthew 2, verse 2. This star, it's Christ's star. It's Jesus' star. This is his, and he is king of the Jews. The wise men, if they were studies of the Old Testament, they were watchers of the stars. They have been waiting for this moment, and they get to Jerusalem, and they begin to ask around, and they position themselves in front of the earthly king Herod. How does he respond? Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. He was disturbed to his core at this moment, especially if he has his own family members killed. Think about the turning gears in his head or even his heart. Like, there's another king, and they're going to worship him? Like, he's going to rival my throne. He's going to it's going to be a battle between me and this new king kind of thing. This trouble is again testimony to the greatness of Jesus, Charles Spurgeon says. Even as a young child, Jesus of Nazareth is so potent a factor in the world of mind that no sooner is he there in his utmost weakness, a now born king, that he begins to reign. Before he mounts the throne, friends bring him presents, and his enemies compass his death. Not only was Herod troubled, but all of Jerusalem with him. The all of Jerusalem, it points us to something in particular. It points us to specific trouble. Verse 4 kind of unpacks it for us. And assembling the chief priests and scribes of the people, he, Herod, inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. Now, this paranoid Herod hears a question from these wise men from the east, and he goes to the ones who have the answer, chief priests and scribes. It's interesting that he goes to the chief priests and scribes. They were the chief priests were the ruling members of the Sanhedrin. That's kind of like the Supreme Court of the Jews. They held trials. Particularly the key trial was Christ's trial before his crucifixion. They ruled over that. That was the chief priests. The scribes were teachers of the law. They knew the Old Testament back and forth. They knew the traditions of the prophecies. They knew it all. The chief priests, the scribes, they were the religious leaders in Jerusalem. Jesus would later rebuke them in Matthew 23 with several woes. Woe to you scribes, woe to you Pharisees, woe to you hypocrites. Jesus told his listeners to respect the scribes and Pharisees due to their position, but not to emulate them. Jesus particularly says this, for they do not practice what they preach. But Herod goes to them. They could tell Herod where Christ was born. They do, but they never themselves went to worship him. They were indifferent to him and to his birth. How do we know they knew where Christ was born? Verse 5 and 6. They told him, they, the chief priests and scribes, told him, Herod, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. They quote Micah 5:2. Particularly the location and what he was to do. Bethlehem, he was going to be a ruler who will shepherd Israel. But sadly, these experts, these religious leaders, they had the right information, but they were uninterested in meeting the Messiah themselves. How many of us go to church on a regular basis? How many of us pray before our meals? How many of us could tell you a lot of facts about Jesus, even the Christmas story, but never truly follow him as Lord? You see, we can know facts and truths of the Bible, but if we never follow Jesus, it's all for naught. Charles Spurgeon, Herod heard a good Bible study about the Messiah, but it did him no good. When the earthly king dabbles in theology, it bodes no good to truth. Herod, among the priests and scribes, is still Herod. Some men may be well instructed in their Bibles and yet be all the worse for what they have discovered. A question for you to kind of ponder. Is your faith in Jesus for the forgiveness of your sins? Is your faith in Jesus for the salvation of your soul? Is your faith in Jesus? If so, take up your cross this Advent season and follow Jesus. But Herod gives the wise men some instructions, verse 7 and 8. Herod summoned the wise men secretly, just like the secret trial they give to Jesus, and ascertained for them what time the star had appeared. And he went and he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring word to me that I too may go and worship him. If you were to read the rest of Matthew chapter 2, you would soon realize that Herod's heart was far from worshiping this newborn king of the Jews. Verse 16 of chapter 2, Herod sent and killed all male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old or under. This again points to the fact that many can say with their mouth that I love Jesus or I follow Jesus, but their hearts are far from him. Herod's heart is not about worshiping Jesus. Herod's heart was, I don't want another king born to rival my throne. In life, we can all say the same thing. I want to be master of my domain. I want to be the captain of my ship. I don't want Jesus to rule my life. And so all the decisions we make, all the choices we make, all the things we decide to do, instead of deferring to King Jesus, we live our lives in such a way that I am master. Herod did the exact same thing. Let it not be said of me, Pastor Ryan, as the prophet Isaiah says, these people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Herod, with his heart far from God, sends the wise men away in hopes to stop this newborn king. We've mentioned before several times on this podcast, nothing will thwart or stop the plans of God. From the garden, Genesis 3:15, God gave the promise, I'm sending someone who is going to crush the serpent. The serpent and history itself has all been, from that very moment, trying to stop the plans of God. You cannot stop the plan of God. Jesus was, is, and will be plan A. He is the long-awaited Messiah, as Matthew writes. He is the Savior of the world, as we have seen in the New Testament, and he is coming back to reign and rule over his church, his bride, his people. Verse 9 of Matthew chapter 2, after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, this star that they had seen rose before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. This star was a supernatural, miraculous star of Jesus himself. God himself guides these wise men to that which they were waiting for. It points us to God miraculously guiding his people in the Old Testament, cloud by day, fire by night through the Exodus. There are supernatural, miraculous things that happen in our lives on a regular basis, whether good or bad. And if we are looking for Jesus in the midst of them, we will find him. That which we are searching for is what we are longing for, is what we are going to see. There's a moment in the book of Luke where Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, and he shares this, Luke 11, 9 through 10. And I tell you, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find, knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, it will be opened. The three verbs, ask, seek, knock, they're present imperatives, meaning in this context of teaching, they encourage prayer as a continual habit of life. If I ask, I'm praying. I'm asking God himself. If I'm to seek, I'm seeking God himself. And if I'm knocking on the gates of mercy of God. Everyone who asks receives does not mean that the believer always receive what they ask for. However, because God is wiser than we are and has better plans for his children than we can ever imagine, when we ask, God gives. When we seek, God reveals. When we knock, it's opened to us. The wise men were seeking Christ, the Messiah. God gave them a sign, the star of Christ, the Messiah's star. God was guiding them, even in the midst of Herod. And they would find Jesus. They do a couple of responses. Verse 10 through 12. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Similar to the shepherds in the field when the angel gives them good news of great joy. Verse 11, and going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. This was a child. This was a toddler. It's not a newborn baby. And so if your wise men are in your nativity scene, if they're standing next to baby Jesus in the manger, you need to take your wise men and your camels and kind of move them across the living room, wherever your nativity scene is, because they're not there yet. Verse 11 still, when they see him, they fell down and they worshiped him. Opening their treasures, they offered him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. The only proper response to King Jesus is to fall down and worship. It points us to Revelation 7, 9, and 10. Behold, a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, crying out with a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Not only did they travel miles to worship King Jesus, but they also give him gifts. These gifts point us to something strong. The gold, it points to Christ's royalty, his kingship. The incense speaks of his divinity. He's fully God and fully man. And the myrrh points to death. Yet, it's almost certain that the Magi did this unaware. They probably didn't know all that there was to know about Jesus and his life, but they knew that he was the long-awaited Messiah. And they have come from far away to worship him. We see three people in the passage and three responses. Herod, King Herod, the earthly king, he viewed Jesus as a threat to his throne and authority. The priests and the scribes, they were indifferent towards Jesus, all the while retaining their religious respectability. They knew of the prophecies and the location of the Messiah, and yet it did not change their life. And then you have the wise men who were waiting, seeking out Jesus. And this star they followed and they worship him, even at great cost, even before the earthly king Herod. I'll end with what I started with. Charles Spurgeon says this: those who look for Jesus will see him. Those who truly see him will worship him. And those who worship him will consecrate their substance to him. Love God, love people, make disciples.